Video games are an odd medium if you really think about it. Tens of thousands of years of humanity, and only in the past couple decades have we achieved a storytelling method where you're fully in control, where you're the lead character, the brains behind everything from beginning to end. I mean, there were things like choose-your-own-adventure novels or Dungeons & Dragons, but even those were relatively recent inventions, and they never provided the full visual aspect that video games do. So, as a result, video games have a number of storytelling tools that other mediums really don't. So, today, I want to take some time to look at one aspect of this, namely character growth. After all, many a good story follows the tale of some man or woman, or otherwise, overcoming a variety of obstacles and, as a result, growing as a character. So, I want to look at aspects of character growth that are relatively unique to video games, specifically RPGs, since that's like 90% of what I play. So, to start off, at a fundamental level, pretty much every character-based video game has some sort of character growth innately built into it. You know, gaining levels, learning new skills, obtaining new weapons, and what have you. Games themselves are basically tailor-made to simulate growth in your characters a lot of the time. You start off the game as some milquetoast little village boy or whatever, dealing with rats in a sewer, and by the end you're a dragon-slaying machine, killing gods and saving the entire world, with nary a hair out of place. But this is a very broad sort of generalization of growth. It's just kind of the character gets physically stronger after completing some certain requirements, and that's about all it tells us. Now, what I'm trying to look at more specifically is the use of gameplay to directly show off a character's growth, a change in attitude, or maybe lessons learned, or different outlooks on life. Because those are the parts of a story that start to get really interesting, that get you invested in these characters, and it's a big reason why I've invested so much time in video games as a whole. And, well, there are a number of examples that come to mind, so let's start with one of the more obvious ones. Something I like to call the class change. Now, in the world of video gaming, games where your character can shift between multiple classes or jobs are pretty commonplace. And a lot of the time, they more or less just act as an aspect of gameplay. Sometimes Bart chooses to show up to battle with a sword and shield, sometimes he wants to show off his furry pride, and sometimes he's ready to boogie on down to that disco beat. But at the end of the day, Warrior Barts and Dancer Barts are both the same Barts. But this isn't always the case. Sometimes a class change isn't just a gameplay element, sometimes it's directly tied to a character's storyline, usually a turning point in the character's arc. Probably the most obvious example of this is Cecil from Final Fantasy IV, who starts off his life as a somewhat bitter Dark Knight in employ of the King of Baron, but over the course of the game, Cecil begins to realize things like the darkness within the king and the difference between duty and doing what's right, and eventually comes to a big turning point in the story when he changes classes. The moment he discards the hate-filled ways of the Dark Knight and becomes a caring and dutiful paladin, giving both a symbolic change in his personality as well as a more direct gameplay change in how the character plays. Now, most games aren't quite as overt as Final Fantasy IV, but there are a lot of games that use the class change to signify a major changing point in a character's story, like when Haseo gets to dual-wield guns, or when a non-fool gets their upgraded persona. All these are aspects that affect the gameplay of the character while also showing off their change in personality or otherwise. But of course, class changing isn't the only way to signify a character changing over the course of a game. Another way that I find surprisingly often is a change in victory quotes, oddly enough. In a way it makes sense. I mean, RPGs are rather notorious for having characters repeat lines.
I think that enemy got the point.
So, changing them up as the game goes along seems like a logical solution. Still, they're an interesting way to show off the progress a character has made. Usually this is always done after big revelations in a character's story arc, or maybe after time skips or something like that. Some examples of this include Persona 3, where each character, after obtaining their upgraded persona, gets a new different victory pose and quote, or Fire Emblem Three Houses, which has a big mass change to every character depending on whether you're playing with their pre- or post-time skip version.
Right makes might, right? Might makes right.
But, personally, I think my favorite example comes from Tales of the Abyss. Every once in a while, after battle, Luke will shout his own praises at kicking the enemy's ass, only for Tyr to rip the pedestal from under his feet and bring him crashing back down to Earth.
Man, I was awesome. Did you see me?
Your footwork was sloppy. You missed their vital points. You were a mess.
Oh, shut up.
But, as the game goes on, Luke's cocky attitude begins to subside a bit, and Tyr's cold edge also slightly lets off.
I thought I did pretty well there.
You move too much. You can't think about your reaction, just react.
You never let up.
Until by the end we get...
That was too easy. Nobody can beat us.
Good work. Just don't get too excited.
I know.
Aw, they're starting to like each other. But as I said, it's a cute little way of showing just how far a character has come emotionally rather than just physically, but keeping it within the elements of gameplay. That being said, those two elements aren't entirely unique to video games. I mean, certainly they're mainstays of the medium, but a sudden character power-up or a change in behavior can be done in other medium. So, I just wanted to give 3 direct examples that I've found that have managed to incorporate character growth directly into gameplay. They provide a unique look at how a character has changed over the course of a story that wouldn't be possible were it not for them being video games. Right, so, first off, I would like to direct your attention to Pokemon. And yes, I am as surprised as you are that I'm drawing inspiration from this series, but here we are. Pokemon, weirdly enough, does a really good job of creating characters based off what Pokemon they use. Not the main character, obviously, they're a blank slate. You could easily erase their face and replace it with a sign saying, "Insert selfie here," and it wouldn't affect anything, but with many of the other characters you come across, particularly your rivals and your enemies, what Pokemon they use can kinda tell a story all of its own. Because, you know, there are so many different Pokemon to choose from, any sort of change or choice in their team can show off a change in that character. A good example of this is Oleana from the recent Sword and Shield, who was shown to be very ladylike and professional, but when driven to battle, she kind of snapped and went a little aggro on you. Which in turn is represented by her team being almost entirely cutesy female Pokemon, except for her final and strongest one, being a freaking Garbodor of all things. That, in and of itself, isn't an example of character growth. I just always thought it was kind of a cute little design choice. Now, for an example of character growth, let's instead go way farther back to Pokemon Gold and Silver, and the character Silver, or as I'm sure most of you call him, question mark, question mark, question mark. He goes through a predictable arc of caring and Pokemon are friends and we should actually respect them, blah 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 blah, same story, different color. Importantly though, the actual process of this is rather poetically shown with his team. Before he comes to the realization that, Pokemon are friends, his team includes things like a Kadabra, a Haunter, and a Golbat. But after his big revelation, and he begins to change who he is, when he challenges you again, they have evolved into Alakazam, Gengar, and Crobat. Notably, 2 Pokemon that require interaction with others in order to evolve, and another that requires a close bond with its trainer. While the story itself was already pretty clear in how Silver had changed up to this point, the direct change in his actual team is a nice punctuation point to help drive across just how far he has come. Another good example comes from Pokemon Sword and Shield, and I never really thought I'd be drawing positives out of Sword and Shield. Whatever. So the character I want to talk about is Hop, your main rival. Partway through the journey, Hop goes through something of a midlife crisis, believing himself to be too weak to carry his family's name and continue on with his journey. This is talked about a bit in the game, but more importantly, it's emphasized by Hop almost completely changing his entire party, ditching his Wooloo and Corvisquire that he had started his journey with in favor of things like Trevenant and Heatmore. However, later on in the game, after Hop begins to regain his confidence and discover who he is as a person, his old lineup returns, stronger than ever, and remain with him for the rest of the game. Both of these just really help to kind of expand on what kind of message they're sending for the character, how they want to portray them, and it's honestly really well done. Another example I can bring up, which again I am amazed that I am bringing up in a positive light, comes from the game Kingdom Hearts. Early on in Kingdom Hearts, our main character Sora is assaulted by a legion of monstrous entities known as the Heartless. Sora, being the best fighter on the island, it's proven, suck it Riku, has no choice but to try and take them on with his trusty wooden sword, only to find that he literally cannot hurt them. Doesn't matter what you do, your sword just floats harmlessly through them. But of course, you get a magical key, which allows you to fight the Heartless, and you go on an interplanetary adventure spanning the 4 corners of the Disney library. But interestingly enough, later on in the game, Sora inevitably loses the Keyblade for a short period of time, and his trusty wooden sword is returned to him. And well, after such a long journey, such an increase in strength, all the lessons learned up until now, Sora still does jack squat to the Heartless with a wooden sword. However, he can actually attack them now. And, well, he does it magic, which is weird because I kind of thought that he got that from the Keyblade, but apparently he can still cast it. So, well, yes, Sora's power was almost entirely due to the Keyblade. It seems like, in just the smallest of ways, he has grown on this journey, and honestly, I love little details like that. I love the fact that you couldn't even touch them before, but now you can kind of barely maybe fight them with just the wooden sword. But let's move on to the final example I have to give for this video, and I think it's my favorite example of all. This comes from a much less well-known game, a little PS2 title known as Radiata Stories. A honky-tonk fun little game about an upbeat kid called Jack Russell and his quest to become a great knight like his father. It also gets weirdly dark about halfway through, notably when you talk to a dwarf about how his entire species is doomed to go extinct after a bunch of assholes beat him half to death. But it also has jokes like this.
That's your bed back there. When you're done with the death whales, come in and get changed.
So it's a decent game, but there's a few tone issues. Anyways, the character in question I want to talk about here is not Jack, however, but the main heroine of the game, a girl named Ridley. A young noble born into a very prestigious family, she took it upon herself to become a knight, not because she had to or anything, but because she wants to prove that she's more than just some spoiled rich daddy's girl. And I mean, when your dad looks like this, yeah, fair play. Anyways, Ridley is always shown to be exceedingly competent at almost anything. A solid combatant, well-read, and even a fair amount of logic when tackling unpredictable situations, though perhaps a bit too arrogant for her own good. However, she's still inexperienced, but it doesn't really show you that in cutscenes. Instead, the game goes about showing you this through the combat animation she has. Normally in combat, she does a little 1-2 swing with her axe, providing a solid chunk of damage. Notably, she's able to take Jack down in a training match between the two of them. However, every once in a while, she decides to add something to her arsenal. And whenever she tries it, she promptly loses control of her rather hefty weapon and falls on her backside. That's probably the only real weakness you ever see from Ridley early on in the game, and it's a great way of showing that while she's good at most things, she's not perfect. But it only gets better from here, for you see, after the first mission is complete, Ridley and Jack get separated due to several circumstances and don't see each other for quite a while. When you do see her again, she's a very different person than she once was. Her somewhat haughty tone from the beginning is mostly gone, and she's clearly been through quite a lot since you last saw her. And well, there's a couple ways the game goes about showing off this difference between old Ridley and new, but there's one big one. She's all grown up. She's a strong, independent warrior now. One who can whirl that giant axe around like a Final Fantasy protagonist. With that all said, these aren't mind-shattering design choices or anything. They're just kind of details. Little details a developer throws in to just give a tiny bit of insight to a character. And while they're nothing too grand, whenever I come across something like this, a small little bubble of happiness wells up within me. The fact that a game would take the time to flesh out a character in such a small but noticeable way just makes me smile. It's the kind of thing that can really make a game evolve from something mundane and forgettable to a genuinely enjoyable experience. But not Sword and Shield, those games fucking suck.